Hi, thank you for joining us at the on-demand session, The Evolving World of Data Sharing. My name is Kim Retzlaff, and I am the Senior Editorial Manager at the American Waterworks Association. I am also the chair of this year's ISMTE Planning Committee. I'm really excited to introduce our speakers today, all three of whom have excellent experience and expertise related to data sharing policies and best practices. We're going to hear from Isabel Mulhern, the Senior Editorial Operations Manager at PLOS One, Tim Vines, Project Lead at DataSeer and Managing Editor at Origin Editorial, and Daniela Lowenberg, Dryad Product Manager and Make Data Count Principal Investigator at the California Digital Library. Our speakers haven't declared any conflicts of interest related to this presentation. Before we get started, I have just a couple of housekeeping items. This is an on-demand session that's pre-recorded, so what that means is, as an attendee, you can watch and rewatch this anytime through the month of August using our conference app, Whova. We also are going to have Daniela join us at the live exchange forum and happy hour on August 6th from 5:15 to 6:15 p.m. Central Time. We hope you can join us for that and ask her some questions about this presentation. You can also talk to other attendees about this session by joining the discussion on the community page in our conference app. And so the way this session is going to work is our panelists are very familiar with each other, and they are going to have a discussion about data sharing together that they're going to let us listen in on. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Isabel, and Daniela to get us started. So let me stop sharing. And please go ahead, take it away.
Hey, Izzy. So in past lives, we worked together at PLOS on data sharing. And I'm wondering if you can tell those who are watching a little bit about what is going on at PLOS with data sharing, what you guys have in effect, what it is that you guys are focusing on for research data.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks, Daniela. So yeah, I'll start by just giving a little rundown of how PLOS approaches data sharing. So we really formalized our requirements in 2014. I should pause here to acknowledge that Daniela at that time was a manager on PLOS One and played a huge role in implementing these data sharing policies and applying them. So thanks for that. Just to give a rundown, PLOS requires authors to make all data necessary to replicate their studies findings available at the time of publication without restriction. When specific legal or ethical restrictions prohibit authors from publicly sharing their data set, they have to indicate how others could access the data. So so this would be, for instance, if there's patient data or data that's owned by a third party. And our compliance is strong because we the policy before we publish articles. So we ask for the statement up front. We do some assessment during peer review to make sure that if the authors aren't able to adhere to the requirement, we know that and can reject the article. And then we review all statements and enforce the policy post-editorial accept, but pre-publication. So the majority of our authors are actually choosing to share their data in supplementary files. So in 2019, that was about 66% of authors were publishing the data alongside the paper in a supplementary file. In 2019, 26% of authors were sharing data in repositories. And that's grown slightly. So if we looked at 2016, for instance, only 20% of authors were sharing data in repositories, but that's a pretty incremental growth. And then also I should say, as I mentioned, some restrictions are permitted, and about 8% of our authors don't publicly share the data at the time of publication, and instead in their statement will explain how the data can be accessed, upon request through whatever restrictions. And we will vet both the reason for the restriction and the way that the reader could access the data.
Izzy, so PLOS One has a lot of clinical research appearing in it, and my impression is that always it's hard to get clinical data to be made public, not least because the ethics boards often forbid the sharing of the data. So do you feel that 8% is because the other clinical study authors are sharing the data? somehow maybe they're all anonymizing it, which would be amazing, or is there something else?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first, I'll give a little caveat about how I pull these numbers. So I use, because we're publishing so many statements, I use text finding to identify statements that are, stating that there are restrictions. So it's possible this number isn't 100% accurate, but I think it's, pretty close. And yes, to your second point, authors who are publishing clinical studies sometimes are able to make anonymized data available, or a smaller sort of data set, always adhering to what's required by their institutional review board. And we do see that fairly regularly. And you're right. I mean, I think if I were to look at our subject area terms, I think we would be at about 40% of our papers are, somewhere in the in the medical clinical range. So yeah, kind of a mix of both those things.
Participants. Yeah.
So obviously there's going to be difficulties in implementation, and it's been 6 years since that was implemented. What does it seem like that the feeling around at PLOS is about investing in the data policy and supporting it here on out?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so for publishers, open data policy application and enforcement is an investment. It's a worthwhile investment that we will definitely be obviously continuing to do and want to sort of optimize how our authors are sharing data. So like I mentioned before, we've seen sort of a modest but not significant increase in repository sharing. And as a publisher, we really want to encourage our contributors to have their data not just accessible, but usable, discoverable. And we have to balance this with what our contributors want and what we can afford to do in terms of our investment. So those are kind of like some of our considerations. But I also wanted to mention that there's evidence that has emerged that following this best practice and linking publications to data and repositories could be beneficial for authors in making papers more reused and cited. So we think that there's a benefit for authors and for us, basically. And our broad goal is to increase the connectivity and support reproducibility. And we want to test out different ways to do that more effectively. So things that we've considered are partnering with repositories, potentially process enhancements to make it easier for authors to deposit data in repositories. And then, of course, author education is always going to be a piece of policy enforcement because we will always individual authors to assess both their sort of needs and sometimes their restrictions. Yeah. Oh, and I wanted to mention, we recently conducted a research initiative to better understand what our researchers' priorities and needs are and how well the existing sort of solutions are able to meet their needs. And our takeaway was really that authors recognize the benefits of data sharing in repositories, but improving the experience that we provide as a publisher for how authors can access and use repositories would potentially create positive change and limit the dependence on publishing data in supplementary files, which we agree is absolutely best practice. Yeah, and I'd also say that some qualitative research and just from the discussion that we have with authors every day, we know that depositing data in supplementary files will potentially remain a popular way to share their data because from an author's perspective right now, it may be the most convenient. So, where we can provide other opportunities for them to share with repositories that could improve there. But it also from an author's perspective is easily sort of linked to the article and available. So could be a potential barrier. Oh yes, and then lastly, wanted to note that Editorial Manager, which is our content submission system, is rolling out an integration with third-party data repositories that would provide publishers with the opportunity to integrate that into the submission. So giving authors the opportunity to navigate to a third-party repository to share their data at submission. So we're going to be looking into testing that as a potential way to, create some process improvement that would make it easier for authors.
Yeah, that all is really great information. And I'll shamelessly plug in return that I've been working with Editorial Manager for 2 years on that integration. And if folks want to ask questions about the integration at the experts hour that I'll be live at, I'm happy to talk about what that integration looks like. But I agree that a real problem here is how you can make things convenient without waiting for these integrations that take years. So what is it in the meantime that we can do to make this easier? So it's nice to hear you touch on the very real problem that is. Tim, did you have other questions for Izzy?
I was actually wondering if that study, the results of that study were going to be made publicly available.
Yeah, they are. They're the research study that we've just completed that I mentioned. Yeah. Yes, great question. So I believe that they are planning to release them, but haven't yet put together a paper. But yes, in the works.
Okay, I'm very interested to read it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'll make sure I share it.
Kim, did you have questions for us?
I do, thank you. So my journal just changed from encourages data sharing to expects data sharing. So if we want to keep moving forward in our data sharing policies and move on to like a mandate, which I think is what PLOS is using now, what do you recommend for next steps, into including how we talk to our editorial board and get buy-in for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think the most important thing is having a clear and enforceable policy about what's required that's realistic for your sort of contributors and anticipates the questions that they have. So you know what you're going to have to solve for during the submission process. And emphasizing the need for reproducibility in the manuscript finding should be top of the list. In terms of working with the editorial board, I would say, as much as possible, you can partner with them to figure out what concerns they have in advance and figure out in advance how to, assess the unique challenges that there might be in your sort of field or discipline, and ensure that your policy application is sort of flexible enough to handle these. So, for instance, on PLOS One, I provided some examples of restrictions that may come up, may not be an issue in your specific field. Another thing to think about is how you're going to assess the appropriateness of repositories that authors selected, and what the best practices are in your specific field or discipline. And on PLOS One's sort of public-facing author site, we have a long list of recommended repositories, including some that are sort of broken down by subject area. I think that's kind of a great place to start when you're thinking about how you're going to help sort of authors move into a place where this is a requirement, not just a suggestion. Yeah, and then I'll also say, I mean, I touched on this briefly, but having the data availability statement as a unique piece of metadata is what really allowed us to formalize this policy, and what will make it sort of easier both from a sort of publisher perspective and in the editorial office when you're assessing each statement as it comes through, and from a reader and contributor perspective. So having the statements, I think, is important, although it does require some investment on the editorial office side.
Yeah, speaking of, I do wonder how much time is spent by members of your editorial office verifying and checking all of this stuff around the data policy.
Such a great question. I'll give you the scary number first, but then the caveat that these are PLOS One numbers. So on one, this work is, of course, distributed amongst our publications assistants. And when I add it all up, it does come to about one full-time employee's worth of time. However, keep in mind that's at PLOS One volume. So if I break it down per accepted manuscript, it's more like an average of 6 or 7 minutes per article. So that's not even per submission, that's like per what's being published. So, it's manageable. That's an average, for statements where assistants are working with authors and talking about potential restrictions. That's obviously going to take a bit more time. But that's sort of generally, what we invest on it. I should also say we use a we use a structured reviewer form for our reviewers when they're assessing each manuscript. And one of the questions is specifically about whether the data is included. So there is some component that's assessed during the review process. But yeah, from an editorial office perspective, that's where most of the time is spent.
Did anyone else have any other questions for Izzy? PLOS perspective? Cool.
Great. Well, I actually wanted to transition and Tim, ask you, from your perspective, who's really pushing for data sharing policies and why?
Yeah, I think I'm going to sort of wax philosophical for a minute about this, because, you know, getting up to that sort of 40,000 feet view of why are we doing this, maybe we'll clarify perhaps where we're hitting the stumbling blocks and where that's coming from. And so at the general level, why do we want to share data? I think it's sort of universally accepted that the philosophy of science is trust but verify. And the data underlying the article are required for verification. It's very, very difficult to work out whether what the authors did or what the authors claim to have done and what they're reporting matches what the data say without the data. You can't verify an article. You can't reproduce their analyses without the data sets. And so I think everybody involved in research these days accepts that you need the underlying data sets. And it's my understanding that way back when, up till about the 60s and 70s, the data sets generally were included with articles, but just in the sort of appendix or supplemental material that appeared after the article. And that was generally possible because the studies didn't have a vast number of data points. You could put all of the data on 3 or 4 pages. And then as data sets got bigger and bigger in the 60s and 70s, and processing power to deal with those data sets grew, then the data sets couldn't really be put in on the page, and then they sort of became supplemental files, and then I think we just forgot to look for them. And so now we've arrived at a situation, as I think we're painfully aware, is that not a lot of data is getting shared. And the organization, the stakeholder that really feels this most acutely and most directly are the funders, because they are giving money to researchers to produce research. And clearly the raw data is a major component of that research product. And they very much don't want that data to languish in the file drawer and eventually disappear, or to be stuck on someone's zip drive for the next 20 years before going in the trash. That data is effectively dead at that point. And so they want it to be public, to be reused, and used to check the results of the research to make it more robust. So it's the funders who've brought in, who've done a lot to talk about data sharing. But for them, it's very difficult because they can give money to researchers and say, you've got to share all your data, but it's so hard unless they have like a live camera in the lab to work out what data sets the authors have produced. And a lot of these data sets, if they're not part of a publication, just sit on a lab computer, and there's absolutely no way to detect them and ensure they're made public. And that's perhaps naturally why everyone's attention focuses on the research article. They're made public so you can see them, and researchers tell the granting agency, this is what I did with the money last time round, and these are the papers I published. And also because it's possible, it's easier to sort of circumscribe the data set that's associated with a single research article than it is to come up with a general statement about all the data that there are out there. And so funding agencies ask researchers to make the data available alongside their article because they've got a very direct interest in doing so. But of course, focusing on the article means we have to bring in journals and publishers. And funding agencies, their job is to give out money for greater societal benefit. And on the other hand, journals and publishers have to balance revenue against expenditure. And the effort that you put into making data public has to be balanced by a revenue that accrues from that. doing something for the good of science as a whole is great, especially if it doesn't cost a vast amount of money to do it. But when it's an expensive proposition, like going through an individual article and working out what data sets the authors have and whether they've shared them in the correct places, that gets expensive very fast. The PLOS One model obviously has to deal with the very high volume that they have there, but other journals like Genome Research from Cold Spring Harbor, they have dedicated data curators, PhD level or postdoctoral level researchers who dig through their much smaller output, and I think spend quite a lot more time per article. And so that's an expensive proposition to do that, to have PhD level people working full time checking your articles. And so there's got to be some financial benefit to having the data shared alongside the article. Clearly it's a better article from a scientific point of view, but is it a better article? Is it worth more? There is some evidence, not dramatic evidence, that having the data shared alongside the article does it lead to an increase in citations, but it's hard to draw the line to more money arriving from having a slightly higher impact factor. And it's therefore difficult for journals and publishers to jump in and say, yes, let's spend all this money on data sharing, when it's not clear we're going to get it back in any way. And so that's one of the big whys, or that's the big hows. How are we going to push for data sharing without breaking the bank? And either we've got to make enforcement of data sharing policies very cheap and find a way that takes out these very expensive people doing it, or we've got the answers, we've got to ask someone else to kick in. For example, funders could say, sure, we'll pay this APC, but in order to get this APC, you have to ensure that the data for the article that we're paying the APC for has all of its data shared in the right place. It's made fair, it's findable, accessible, and so on. And that could be a substantial stick for the journals to get on with that. But of course, there's a lot of other stuff, including Coalition S and so on, going on around transfers of money from funders to journals, and who knows whether there's any space in that conversation for that sort of thing. And the last sort of stakeholder groups I want to bring in, like institutions, I mean, as a technical point, so there are some funders who require that the institutions ensure that the grantees at that university, especially the ESPRC, the Physics Council in the UK, they require the institution to ensure that the data from its researchers is shared, and that's pretty radical. And I don't think that model is coming generally, but it's certainly one way to go. But the missing group here, the missing section, is the researchers. And I think as editorial office people, there are definitely researchers who are very much into open data and see that it's important and valuable and push for it. But 90% of researchers are not really bothered about it. And of that 90%, probably well more than half see it as a painful and annoying thing to do at publication, and to some extent an invasion of their privacy or a questioning of their ethics as scientists. You want to see my work? That's outrageous. Why didn't you just believe me? And I think that just illustrates how far we've got from this trust but verify, and what that really means for publishing science. So yeah, that's that's the long-winded answer. But yeah, the push for the why, but the push for the data sharing policies comes from some authors and some editors, but it's not a general phenomenon at all. There's not this huge groundswell of please help us share our data.
Well, with that said, what do you think the biggest driver for this push for open research data is?
I think it's a great combination of the very passionate researchers who just keep talking about it and saying this is ridiculous, and then holding authors to account when they publish an article in a journal. It's a controversial article perhaps, and the authors are published in a journal with a data sharing policy and they haven't provided the data, and they duly get, pulled over the coals on Twitter, and then it's very public that they haven't really shared the data, and that in turn says to the journal, oh, people care about this, people are watching, and so we need to do a better job. And so there is at the moment this sort of spiral, but what's missing is an easy way to make it happen, because the journal's faced, okay, let's bring on 3 PhD level people to check through our data sharing. And I used to do this for molecular ecology, and it was intense and maddening, especially when authors didn't really get it, and you had to sort of explain what data are and where they should go and what they think. And that was frustrating and puzzling.
The sort of history you described has been somewhat sort of patchy in terms of progress towards this open data landscape. Why do you think that is?
So I think certainly in the clinical realm, as we mentioned before, the research ethics boards have for a long time said there's no way the data from this study that we're greenlighting is going to be made public ever and has to be destroyed after 2 years. And so that's the absolute opposite of data sharing. And overcoming that inertia, having clinicians campaigning to overcome something they didn't really want to do in the first place, that has made it very slow. And there are quite a lot of clinicians that now are pushing REBs to do a better job with that. So that's perhaps why clinical data are taking a long time to come out. But then again, they're the most important data in many ways. I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We're trying to do meta-analyses to understand what's going on with COVID, but we're still trying to do it with summary stats from the journal article. And what we really need is the underlying data sets to join them all together and do meta-analysis on that, which is vastly more effective. So that should be where the most effort is being applied right now, I think. But then in other fields like genetics, or evolutionary biology, where they're all kind of a bit more open to being open, and there's been a long tradition of sharing DNA sequences, which has been hugely beneficial for the community. And then when you say, okay, not along with your DNA sequences, you have to share this and this, like, oh, okay, I get it. It makes sense. And so genetics and genomics, they've roared ahead in terms of data sharing, whilst other fields have sort of lagged a long way behind.
I feel like it's important to add in there too, though, that open data doesn't necessarily mean it's tied to journal publishing. So people have opened up their data in the worlds of, say, Arctic research for over a decade, and they publish their data years before they publish the articles. And so it's good to always distinguish like open data policies within this journal publishing world versus maybe open data more generally.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. There are some amazing initiatives where enormous data sets are getting made public. Those are especially in the case of big infrastructure that's been brought in. I mean, a lot of the physics things, physics initiatives make quite unbelievable amounts of data every minute and then share a substantial fraction of it immediately. And that's been huge. That's been really amazing for how science has progressed in these areas.
Okay, last question for you, Tim, from me anyway. So from an editorial office perspective, which Kim and I both have, what should we be doing to help our journals move toward open data or more open data?
I suppose it depends a little bit where you're starting. If you're starting from it's not really mentioned, I think adopting a data sharing policy would be where you would start, and that's and then perhaps increasing the not severity, the requirements of that policy over time, so that your authors get used to the idea of sharing data over 3 or 4 years, and that they can also see the benefits, and they can see, oh yeah, the articles appearing in this journal that I follow are more satisfying because I can get in and try and understand what's being said in this article, so they, as researchers themselves, can benefit. Yeah, as you said, the data sharing statement is if you can have that infrastructure in your workflow where the data sharing statement is required to be present, molecular ecology, we used to just unsubmit the article until the authors had provided a data sharing statement that wasn't just, I don't know, there is no data, or there are no data associated with this article, when clearly there are. Until they'd given us a decent data sharing statement, we would then let it go on through the process. Unsubmitting articles is actually quite in general, a very effective way of helping authors understand what they need to do before they can even, get the article into peer review, because then it's back with them. They can continue, they can fix up their submission and give it back. Beyond that, you just got to be consistently advocating it, for saying this is really important. This is something that's happening really broadly. And then that was very much the voice we were having at the editorial board meetings. This is a movement that's happening in research very broadly. Everyone wants this to happen, and we've got to be part of this. It's important as a journal we keep ahead of this. So they might find that good.
Thank you. Any other questions for Tim?
I do actually. I'm just wondering, is there a specific format that these data statements need to be in? Is there some kind of standardized format, or do you let the authors just declare their data statement however they see fit?
Well, I mean, Izzy knows this as much as I do. It's the best data statements are the ones with an itemized list of the data sets the authors have, and where each of them has been shared with a sort of live DOI, so you can just click through and go to the data sets that are listed there. And the more comprehensive that list is, the better, the easier it is for readers to see what's gone where. A simple bland statement about all the data available in the supplemental material is not very helpful to help you as a reader understand what data sets are there. And indeed, when you often go to the supplemental material, there's sort of a graph there or something, it's not, because they've not itemized it, then there's less accountability for what they should have done. So yeah, those are definitely an order of magnitude better than just a simple sentence of what you would need to do to get hold of the data. I should move on to Danny. Daniela, so you work at the University of California, but you're not currently at a publisher. You have worked in so many data publishing initiatives over the years. What do you think is the important difference between data and other scholarly outputs?
Yeah, so data is, as I interjected earlier, data sharing has been around for a really long time, and data sharing within the journal world came about, in the 2000s, with especially the ecology and environmental sciences communities who recognized as societies how important this was. But the difference about data is that it is a totally different scholarly output than an article. And so it's really important that right now, if you don't have a data policy, having one, but really we have to shift this conversation to how are you going to support at publishers fair and reusable data being published. And so a big part of this, and this will be my big sweeping controversial statement, is that we cannot allow any data to be in supporting information files anymore. And this is because data are its own output. And there's 3 reasons around this. One is that data need their own citable DOI. They need to be, having a DOI also means that you're registering metadata with it. Data have very different metadata than the article. So assuming that an article's metadata works for the data set really makes the data unusable. They need to have their own reuse notes, all the provenance logs of the data, data versioning, et cetera. And so that's something a repository can support for it. And then the third piece is that data need different preservation mechanisms than articles. Data can be in the hundreds of thousands of gigabytes to terabytes range that repositories can support, but journals really can't. And so repositories are set up to have these really trusted preservation policies so that the data will be around forever. But that's really, the 3 components of why it's so important. But one thing that I want to focus a little bit more on is that when data are published in this way and they have a DOI, then we can start to actually look at citations and data set reuse so that we can understand, now that we've been investing for the last 10 to 20 years in publishing data, what is that ROI? What is it that publishing data are doing from the publisher, institution, funder, and other perspectives? And we keep coming back to how do we get researchers involved? That's a big part of it. So step one is actually just getting data into trusted repositories.
On that point of citations being the sort of the next step, that is the realizing the benefit of this, you lead a project called Make Data Count. Can you give us a bit more background on what it is, as a community, publishing community, how we can get involved or contribute to Make Data Count?
Sure. So Make Data Count is an initiative that was initiated and led by California Digital Library, Crossref, DataSite, and bibliometrics groups. It's an initiative that we lead that's focused on the building blocks of data metrics. And so right now, that's really focusing on data usage and data citation. I do want to point out my second controversial sweeping statement of today, which is that we do not have a credit system for data, and that I would encourage journals to not refer to publishing data as credit. And I can get into that in a second, but when I do want to define what data usage versus data citation is. When I'm talking about data usage, I mean views and downloads. So like with article level metrics where you're displaying that on the journal, capturing that for the data itself at repositories. And then there's the data citation. So in a journal, either in the references, through a machine tag data availability statement, in the methods, in some form, when you index with Crossref, calling it a data citation. And so our initiative is really focused around those two key areas. In the publishing world, you guys have the Counter Code of Practice. We have written a separate one through Counter for data. And so a big part about that is having comparable views and downloads across repositories so we can start to see and compare these numbers. Right now, if you go to repositories and you try and say, well, they have more views than this one, it's not something you can do. We don't know how they're being counted. But in terms of this discussion for journals, I want to focus on data citations. And so we don't, while I said we don't have data credit and we don't have data metrics, these are building blocks because we need to have bibliometrics research to actually understand what it all means. Should we really be comparing things in different fields for citations in the same way that this all happened for the journal world? So the data world is inching behind, trying to get there, but the biggest thing that publishers can do is properly index data citations. And right now, that's just not happening. There are data statements, and we see that there, but we're not actually seeing that these claims of this is a citation to a data set is making it to Crossref. And so you might start hearing about how important it is and the advocacy that we're doing with the typesetting vendors that you all work with. But these really do need to be tagged as a data citation. And we've seen the harmful effects of this. If I had slides up right now, I'd show in the references where it shows the data citation, someone, referenced it, and then you go into the XML and then it's not there. It gets wiped. And so at the repositories and through the Make Data Count initiative, working between Crossref and DataSite, we actually pull citations and display them at the repositories. And so that means that journals, researchers, everyone can go see those citations just like you have at articles. It's really important that we can get those, and we only have a small percentage. So shout out to eLife and Nature and a couple of the publishing houses that are doing this. But that's really why it's so important, is we need to be able to capture those, and we just don't have them captured right now. So I would be happy to answer more questions in the other session, specifically about, what is that guidance from Crossref, debunking some of that, talking about references versus data statements. But you can also check out more information at makedatacount.org.
Cool. You've been working on research data publishing from the sort of the publishing, the institution, and the repository perspective, obviously with your involvement with Dryad. What do you see as the progression and evolution of research data? Where are we going?
Very exciting seeing how much support there is for research data now. I mean, there's an entire initiative and gosh, I don't even know what the word for it, but communities that are being built around research data. The Research Data Alliance, RDA, has, you know, something like 200 countries represented into it, and like 200 working groups that were all working on different aspects of research data. So the research data world is moving in an awesome direction. The funders are getting behind it. NIH is showing a lot more support for repositories. NSF has long been involved. The private funders are getting on board, and we can see how important it's been within COVID right now. We can see how many data sets. I mean, anecdotally at Dryad, which is one of the repositories that I work on, we've gotten a huge spike in these, and they're actually happening at the preprint stage before articles, which is a shift in the space in general. It's all very positive. What I would say for the publishing community is to make sure that there's an alignment there. Talking about just getting a data policy in place, encouraging it, is very far away from where the research data, and by research data, I mean institutions and repositories and funders, we're in very distant spaces with those conversations. And so, how do you catch up with that? The two big takeaways I would say is that publishers should move away from supporting information files for data, and to both implement proper data citation practices, and then after it's implemented, educate on it. We know how hard author education is for everything in journal publishing, but right now I wouldn't say is the time to educate about citing data because the infrastructure isn't there yet. So, moving away from supporting information, getting things into repositories, and then after they're in repositories, implementing data citations. And that kind of brings this all together.
Right, yeah. And then there's lines between publishers, between articles and repositories, and those are strong, bright lines that people can see and use and follow. Do you have any other suggestions for how publishers can better support fair data publishing and citation practices?
Yeah, I mean, just pointing researchers to repositories and helpful spaces to find the right repository. One thing where we've seen huge trouble is when publishers choose one or two repositories they really like and push their researchers there. Publishers, you guys have an amazing sway once you've accepted an article to make things happen. And so, a responsible role there is making sure that folks know when to go to a disciplinary specific repository. There's a reason that there are disciplinary specific spaces. It's because of the type of curation that they're doing on the data. And so, speaking from a general repository perspective, we don't want that data, but we get a lot of it. And so for publishers, making sure that, and you don't need to know all of them, there's so many, but there's tons of resources out there like DataCite's repository finder tool, Re3 Data, Fair's Fair, Fair Sharing, a bunch of these. Tim could probably list a bunch more, but pushing to these right spaces so that researchers know about their options of where to go to make that happen. And so it's, just making sure that they know it's on the repositories and the data world for us to make sure that we're supporting FAIR and making sure we're getting the best possible metadata and all of that. So in some ways it's like, push them to us and then just make sure you get the citation back. But I think it's important that we work together more, through integrations like Izzy mentioned, but also just making sure that there's a general alignment here when policies are in effect, that they're supporting, this future world, not just supporting maybe what researchers have said or cared about in the past. It changes all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Kim, you had a question.
Yeah, I think Danielle, you might have just answered it. But coming from the journal perspective and talking again about author education, it sounds like there's resources out there that the journal world should give to the authors to help them understand what their options are. It's not up to the journal publisher to mandate what repository they're supposed to be using. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I think it's great to give options, and, in very specific disciplinary journal cases, it may make sense that there's like one or two repositories that you would just want people to go to. Say, if you're publishing just on oceanographics, you would want people to go to the NSF BICO-DEMO repository. But if you're a broad publisher, like where Izzy is or others, making sure that you just at least have the resource for helping authors choose, but not mandating, because it's really up to them.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. So I think we're pretty much to the end of our discussion. I think, do any of you have any additional comments or thoughts that you want to add before we adjourn? Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot.
I suppose I have answers to the questions, some of the questions I was asking about how we can make data sharing easy, enforcement of policies easy, but I'm going to be talking about that in the innovation session. So if you want to hear more about this DataSeer project I'm on, you should listen to that.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, I want to thank our speakers so much, Daniela, Isabel, and Tim. I really appreciate your time today and the information that you've put forward here. I think it's going to be extremely useful for our audience. So just in closing, I want to remind our attendees that if you want to discuss this topic further, you can visit our community page in the conference app. And this session recording will be posted to the event app and will be available until the end of August. So thank you again, everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.
Thanks, everyone.